to the course Introduction to Urban Planning. In today's lecture, we are going to cover growth and evolution of planning legislation and walk through key acts and dates from UK. Our coverage would be the timeline. So, we would look at the following. We will look at the public health reforms which were taking place in 1800. We have also seen this before during our lectures in contextualizing cities as well as when we dealt with public health issues. Further, we will look at what was Edwin Chadwick's report in 1842. Then thereafter, we will look at the Public Health Acts which came up, and then key research of John Snow's work for cholera. Then we will look at Uthwatt's Committee on Compensation and Betterment charges. Thereafter, we will look at the reform of how working men could vote in 1867. Thereafter, we will look at law against poisoning food and polluting river. Thereafter, we will look at the housing of the Working Class Act which came in 1819. Thereafter, we will look at the Hampstead and Town Planning Act, and then likewise we will look at the Addison Housing Act, House and Town Planning Act of 1919, 1930 Housing Act. Then we will also look at the 1931 Town and Country Planning Act. We will look at the Barlow's Committee, we will look at the Scott Committee of Land Utilization in Rural Area. We will look at the New Town Act, then we will look at series of Town and Country Planning Act from 1947 to 1971. So, these will be our coverage for today. The major learning outcomes which we are looking at is that you should be able to identify these key legislation and you should be able to describe them. Further, you should be able to review the legislative experience and transformation. So, you should be able to sequentially see what context we were going through, and then how our understanding was developing and how each players were playing in this, and then what kind of legislative changes were taking place. Further, you should be able to compare the current global and Indian context, and you should be able to see the direction in which we are taking. So, looking at the first, our context in 1800 and looking at where the planning legislation we stand, Aishar Judge Ahluwalia in her writing in Planning for Urban Development in India, published in 2011, states that the current urban planning regime in India is rooted in the Town and Country Planning Act of United Kingdom of 1947, which we are going to see, and is primarily focused on detailed land use zoning. So, we see that our Indian context is majorly rooted in the Planning Legislation Act from United Kingdom. So, that is why we are looking at all these evolution and growth, what is happening here. Further, she states that this practice was followed by many developed as well as developing countries, but for some years now there has been a move away from the rigid master plan in many countries, including the United Kingdom, and we are moving towards much more flexible planning. So, if you will recollect, we discussed about this during our contextualization of cities series. Cities all over are now exploring more flexible ways to accommodate changes in land use and density pattern over the time. If you will recollect, we also saw this flexibility aspect coming in Bhopal Development Plan. Moreover, she suggests that the earlier approaches in planning, we treated urban transportation as the result of land use planning. However, now we see two-way relationship as we saw in while we discussed TOD in our contextualization of cities. Indian legislations are largely guided by the British law, and there has been shift in the way we have been planning. Keeping this shift in mind, we shall review the UK evolution of planning legislation and then review the Indian context in the next session. The journey of legislation will also show that how we evolved our process and understanding of our processes, power and responsibility. Planning legislation in United Kingdom is considered to be more comprehensive and progressive in its scope than in any other country in the world. Looking at the landscape of Britain, we see that there is challenge of land in Britain. Most of the area are densely populated areas of the world. Reflecting back before public health reform of 1800, we had seen and heard narratives of industrialization period, read about Charles Dickens' Condition of England, novel Creating Coke Town in his novel Hard Times, based on the Liverpool, Manchester and London cities. We witnessed overcrowding, shared water pump, privies, which is shared toilets and open sewers. We also see there was frequent outbreak of disease. We have discussed this a lot in our public health series. There were outbreak of cholera, diphtheria, tuberculosis. Until that time, germs were not discovered. Each time there was an outbreak, nearly 26 to 53,000 people died. Further, we see there was laissez-faire system, which meant the government would not interfere, or there would be no intervention from the government side and market would dominate. At this time also we see that germ theory took some time to come up. Germ theory by Louis Pasteur, it came up in 1861. In 1842, we see Edwin Chadwick report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population. His major claim in this direction was save money by improving health and by providing sewers, water supply and public health facilities and team for taking care of this. We are looking at the report published by him. For a few years, hardly anything happened, even despite his report. We see in 1846, Nuisance Removal Act came in, where we started to defining conditions considered unfit for human habitation and living accommodation. In fact, Chadwick's report was strongly opposed by many MPs of that time who were nicknamed as the Dirty Party. So Chadwick's recommendation meant that council would have to increase the rates. So in order to take care of all the health infrastructure or all these services to be provided, people might have to tax, and this would be unpopular with the well-to-do citizens. So there was resistance in this regard. At the time, there was strong belief of laissez-faire. It was the cholera epidemic of 1848 which led to a change of mind by the government. So it took another epidemic to really realize the importance of the sanitation facility. We see that in 1848, major attempts to improve public health was undertaken following the epidemic. In this, we see 1848 Public Health Act came. However, this was not compulsory. The 1848 Public Health set up the local board of health, which would take care of improving and checking the sewers and water supplies. But this had limited powers. This board had limited powers and had no money. So you may realize how they would really execute on ground. It was the first time that government had legislated on health issues. So it was a key development here. Local authorities were given the power to appoint an officer of health who had to be legally qualified, medical practitioner, and to improve sanitation in their areas. And he would be responsible for collection of rubbish, build sewers, and provide clean water supply. So you can see here the notice for the recruitment of the public health servant. While all this progress was taking place, we see 10% of the population really agreed to pay the tax. The act, as it was passed, was not perfect, but was an important step forward. As per the UK Parliament document, the main limitation of the act was that it provided a framework that could be used by the local authorities, but did not compel action. So it was not compulsory for authorities to really adopt it. We see that 103 towns used it, as it was unpopular as people had to pay for the services, it eventually was abolished in 1854. If you can recollect, around the same time, Dr. John Snow, the physician, when he was investigating cholera spread in Soho in 1854, inferred that the cause for cholera was contaminated water. His evidence included the 70 workers in the local brewery who only drank beer and all survived. Yet public health officials were slow to be convinced. They stubbornly believed in the miasma theory that disease were caused by noxious vapors in the air. We have seen this image before. You can see Dr. John Snow's thematic mapping to indicate the established relationship between contaminated water and cholera. At the same time, 1858, London experienced great stink. We have touched upon this before also. As per the Stories of Cities by The Guardian, by the mid-1800s, the river Thames had been used as a dumping ground for human excrement for centuries. At last, fear of its evil odor led to one of the greatest advancements in urban planning. You may recollect Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system was designed in 1865. So you can see here the picture of the construction of the sewerage system here. As per the description, in the steaming hot summer of 1858, the hideous stench of human excrement rising from the river Thames and seeping through the hallowed halls of the Houses of Parliament finally got too much of Britain's politicians, those who had not already fled in fear of their lives to the countryside, clutching hankies to their noses and ready to abandon their newly built houses for fresher air upstream. The lawmakers agreed upon, when this happened, lawmakers agreed urgent action was needed to purify London of the evil odor that was commonly believed to be the cause of disease and death. The outcome of the Great Stink, as that summer's crisis was coined, was one of the history's most life-enhancing advancement in urban planning. It was a monumental construction project that, despite being driven by doubtful science, we didn't have that kind of engineering at that time, and the political self-interest, dramatically improved the public's health and laid the foundation for modern London. By 1861, it was realized that Chadwick and Snow were right. The scientific evidences which they gave, it was right. Some were more than willing to pay for reform for health, as now there was scientific proof. The heavy investment they made in the city also proved to be of great worth. In 1866, most of London was saved from the cholera outbreak which hit part of East End. The only section which was not yet connected to the new system had the problem. Further, we see following all this, in 1872, we see Public Health Act came in, where appointment of medical officer was made compulsory in urban areas. In 1875, public health, which was compulsory, unlike before, in this sewers and water supply and inspector's position was created. Further, we see in 1875 public health, this particular Public Health Act became compulsory, unlike the act before. In the sewers and water supply and inspector's position was created. So you can see here the Public Health Act from the archival. In 1867, we further see working men could vote. So this kind of reform was also parallelly going on. So when working men were able to vote, then it brought in a lot of change. So you would see that attention to their requirement was important. So this was done at the time of Liberal government of Lloyd George. We see that the Reform Act 1867 effectively doubled the number of men in the United Kingdom who could vote. The passage of this bill came after lengthy and vociferous discussion in the parliament and out. As a result, every male adult householder who lived in a borough constituency now had the vote, as did men who rented and paid £10 in rent. To the electoral votes were added 1.5 million voters. Further, we see in 1875 Artisan Dwelling Act. So now you can see that men could also vote, more number of working men could vote. So now we are seeing emphasis being given here. We see that Artisan Dwelling Act came in, which focused on housing condition, pavement and lighting. It gave local authorities power to buy up and redevelop slum areas, also known as Cross Act of 1875. This act is also known as the Cross Act. And you see that it empowered municipalities to buy and demolish slums and to build housing for rental. The so-called Second Cross Act 1879 also dealt with housing. Also in 1875, Cross carried through Parliament the Factory Act regulating the employment of women and children in textile mills, the Public Health Act, a comprehensive sanitary code, and 2 statutes reinterpreting Gladstone's trade union legislation of 1871 in a sense more favorable to the unions. So you see that now the workers, the unions were getting stronger, and attention was paid to their requirements and the living conditions. As per Dr. Ian Morley's publication in 2005 titled Death and Life in Industrial Settlement, the British model of dealing with urban developments from the 1830s to 1914. Acts such as these were precursors to the development in England and Wales that from the mid-1870s permitted the clearance and rebuilding of large-scale urban districts. So you see a lot of slum clearance happened at that time. By the mid-1870s, municipal responsibility for the urban environment had been shaped by the Artisans and Labourers Dwelling Improvement Act of 1875 and by another Public Health Act, which encouraged the removal of insanitary localities by empowering municipalities to make bylaws relating to street widths, building heights and other matters affecting layout and structure. Within the Public Health Act 1875, England and Wales was divided into urban and rural sanitary districts, which were clearly defined and supervised by the local government board. At the same time, we see in 1870 law against poisoning food and polluting rivers also came up. You can see that how efforts were made to clean the rivers, so this act was also in place to protect the river and also to take care of the food stuff. Further, we see in 1890, Housing of the Working Class Act came. This act extended the Artisan Act of 1875 by offering greatly increased loans to the local authorities. So now local authorities could acquire loan to do the work for the working class people or to provide housing for the working class. Further, we see in 1903, work began on the Letchworth based on the garden cities. So if you recollect, we did this in contextualizing cities. We talked about the garden city coming up. So in 1903, that work started, and based on that, in 1906, Hampstead Garden Suburb Act came in. So here you can see the Letchworth created at that time. Simultaneously, we see that what was parallelly happening at that time. In 1906, free school meals were served. Then we see in 1907, medical checkups in school was also undertaken, and help for new moms was also extended. Furthermore, we see in 1908, old age pension was also started. Then in 1909, housing reforms housing reform happened, and in 1912 free medical treatments in school was also initiated. So you see parallelly how the social reforms has been also gaining momentum here with the change in the voting rights. Looking into the 1909 Housing and Town Planning Act, it was the first enactment to deal with town planning. So here we started dealing with town planning. The act empowered local authorities to prepare town planning schemes in respect of any land likely to be used for building purpose, with general object of securing proper sanitation, condition, amenities and convenience. But this act did not apply to already built up areas, so which was already there, that could not be really be considered under this, but the new construction which was happening under that, they had to follow all these provisions. This act compelled local authorities to tackle substandard housing, new housing development encouraged on garden city principles. Back-to-back housing was made illegal at this time. You can see the map of city of Edinburgh from National Library of Scotland. We further see that in 1918, Addison Housing Act came in. Through this act, construction of 5 lakh new homes were planned. However, only more than somewhat around 2 lakhs could be completed. If you'll see, it's almost 100 years now. So, Addison Act made working class housing a responsibility of the state and paved the way for the construction of hundreds of thousands of council homes. And if you will connect with the Indian scenario, what we studied in the public health segment, where the Bombay plague was also happening, and emphasis was also given to the working class housing in Indian context as well. So, in the image you can see the massive construction which was taking place. Moving on, we see the Act of House and Town Planning of 1919. This was the first time where it was made obligatory for certain local authorities with more than 20,000 population to prepare and submit planning schemes. So, now we see that now they have started identifying the threshold population. So, wherever the population would be 20,000 or above, they have to prepare a planning scheme and they have to submit the planning scheme. The local authority has to submit it. So, thereafter we see Housing Act in 1924, where extensive grants were given to local council for new housing. So, we see that first they were given the responsibility to submit the plans, later on they were also given resources in terms of grants to undertake the housing projects. Further, in 1930s, we see Housing Act came, which required clearance of all remaining slum accommodations and rehousing. In the image you may see Victorian terrace housing due for demolition. In the image you may see the backyard of the tenement house in 1930. Moving forwards, we see Town and Country Planning Act of 1931. In this particular act, you can see the term country was introduced. It was an act to authorize the making of schemes with respect to the development and planning of land, whether urban or rural, and in that connection to repeal and reenact with amendments the enactments relating to town planning. So, to provide for protection of rural amenities and the preservation of buildings and other objects of interest or beauty, to facilitate the acquisition of land for garden cities, and to make other provisions in connection with the matter which was concerned with this. So, we see that even now, if you may recollect, in the contextualizing cities aspects, the concern was also going towards how to counterbalance the shift from the rural to the urban areas. So, now we are seeing that how we are taking care of town and country planning Act, and also looking at how we can really give amenities at the rural areas as well. Moving on, we see in 1937, we see Barlow's Commission for the distribution of industrial population under the chairmanship of Sir Montagu. So, we see we are at the now at the verge of the World War II, and then also we are seeing rapid urban industrialization here, and then also a disbalance between the rural and the urban context. So, this committee was formed, which was required to see the socioeconomic or the strategies disadvantage arise from the concentration of industry in large towns and measure to be taken in the national interest. The observation included that there was heavy unemployment in some regions where people were out migrating. Further, we see growth of slums of working housing was happening without essential amenities, intrusion of factories and go downs into the built up residential areas, traffic bottlenecks during the peak hours in the industrial cities. Further, we see the description includes chaotic unplanned growth of the cities without adequate open agricultural land. Further, we see heavy burden on the concerned local authorities with regards to services. Likewise, we see emphasis on the dispersal of population was also laid, a restriction on further growth on cities, redevelopment of blighted areas. We also remember the term blighted which came in, and then discouraged too much industrial specialization in any district, and there was instruction for guidance of new industrial development to areas suffering from unemployment. So, diversification, decentralization was also thought of at that time. So, the recommendation by the Barlow Commission included to redevelop the congested urban areas, further decentralization of the industries and population from the industrial conurbation. Then the recommendation included achieving a reasonable balance of distribution of industries and the population in the various regions of the country. The central authority should have the powers to refuse consent to the establishment of new or expansion of industries in the overgrown cities unless some overriding reasons exist for allowing it. So, now authority would have the power to decline it. So, that was a suggestion made. So, the outcome of this particular committee's recommendation was that it created Board of Trade under the Distribution of Industry Act of 1945. We later see constitution of Uthwatt Committee on Compensation and Betterment in 1941. Simultaneously, you may reflect it was the war period. As per the Discovery National Archives, Government of UK, the committee was set up by the Minister of Works and Building in 1941 under the chairmanship of Mr. Justice Uthwatt to make an objective analysis of the subject of the payment of compensation and recovery of betterment in respect of public control of the use of land, to advise as a matter of urgency what step should be taken now or before the end of the war to prevent the work of reconstruction thereafter being prejudiced. In this connection, the committee was asked to consider a possible means of stabilizing the value of land acquired for redevelopment, as well as any extension or modification of powers to enable such land to be acquired by the public on an equitable basis. Further, to examine the merits and demerits of the methods considered of acquisition and to advise what alterations of the existing law would be necessary to enable them to be adopted. So, now we are looking at how the land could be taken from the public and what kind of process and system has to be created here. So, looking at their statements of what basis they created for their observations, so they said that ownership of land does not carry with it an unqualified right of the user, and therefore restriction based on the duties of neighborliness may be imposed without liability of payment of compensation. So, you may recollect our initial talk about why do we really need legislation, because there is conflict with the rights of the people. So, we see here how we are justifying or what argument we are putting here. Further in the statement, it is said that but where the restriction imposed are such in scope that they extend beyond the obligation of neighborliness, that means my obligation, I'm supposed to take care of the neighborliness, but then my obligation is going beyond that, then the authority is obliged to pay to the owner. The owner should have the right to compensation. So, the owner of the property is entitled for the compensation. So, that was the statement made here regarding the compensation. So, now we are seeing how from the beginning we started, where we started looking at the importance of sanitation and providing the services. Later we looked at how those things were getting strengthening, and then we realized that for in order to undertake a lot of things, we need land, and once we need land, then we need to compensate people. So, you see how during the evolution of legislation, our understanding in this regard is improving. So, the recommendation made by the committee included the government should announce its intention that compensation payable in respect of compulsory acquisition of land or development rights would not exceed value as determined. In case of approved development, the state should lease the land to the person for undertaking the development. So, even the person can take the development, and it could be, the land could be leased to the person. The state would have the right to purchase the land if required for public or private development. So, the state would also have the right to purchase it from the private owners. Further, we see that the recommendation included fair compensation being paid, and that central fund should be set up for this purpose. So, for this, now you see how the central fund is being set up, and then fair compensation to be paid to the private parties. Further, we see extend powers of compulsory purchase to be made available in respect of built up areas. So, the authority would also have compulsory purchase power. Further, we see that recommendation included for lands in urban areas, 75% of annual increase in land values should be collected as 5 years levy tax. Simultaneously, we see that Constitution of Scott Committee of Land Utilization in rural areas was also formed. So, we were looking at the urban context. Now, we see that the review was also made for the rural areas under the chairmanship of Mr. Justice Scott, appointed in 1941. The rural areas was reviewed. The purpose was to consider the condition which should govern buildings and other constructional development in country areas, country meaning the rural areas, consisting with the maintenance of agriculture and in particular the sectors affecting the location of the industries. So, further, the purpose included to take care of the well-being of the rural communities and the preservation of the rural amenities. So, you may also recollect that we really fancied and liked the countryside. We appreciated the rural life because of the green and the quality of life what was there in the urban area. We see here also the committee issued the statement which described the living conditions in the rural areas. It said that thousands of cottages have no piped water supply, no gas or electric light, no third bedrooms, and often only one living rooms with no separate cooking and scullery accommodation, meaning kitchen. For the great majority of rural workers, a bathroom is a rare luxury. So, a lot of people didn't even have access to bathroom. So, this was the condition at that time in the rural area, and the purpose of this particular committee was to look into how agriculture can be improved, maintained, and also to arrest the shift of the population from rural to the urban areas, and then how the rural area could be improved compared to the urban areas, and then also how to avoid the loss of fertile land. The recommendation of the committee included extension of supply of gases, water and electricity, as well as also declaration of national park in the countryside. Moving on, we see in 1946 New Town Act came. This led to the creation of new towns at Stevenage, Hemel, Hampstead, Basildon, Bracknell, Corby, Crawley, and so on. In the image, you can see the BBC News of 2016, which highlights the Stevenage in Hertfordshire, which was designated the UK's first new town, devised as a radical solution to London's post-war housing crisis. Moving on, we see in 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, which establishes procedure to control the growth of towns and cities. Now we see that now from laissez-faire we are moving on to having more control over the land and how the land has to be used and how and where the places uses have to be planned. So we see that by 1947 Town and Country Planning Act started establishing those procedure. Here we see that it was more control oriented and made provision for development plan, which we follow currently. In the beginning what we talked about Aisha's publication, what it said that we follow 1947 Town and Country Planning Act. So here we reached at 1947 Town and Country Planning Act. You would see that in the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947, the main purpose was to replace the former system of planning control. So you saw series of planning control systems. So the intention was to replace the former system of planning control through rigid planning schemes by a new system of control through flexible development plans based on the up-to-date survey to review once in every 5 years. So a review would be done in every 5 years. So there would be no rigid planning, but then they would be reviewing things every 5 years. The planning administration simplified by reducing the number of planning authorities to 1/10 of their former number. So there were a lot of planning authorities, so that reduction was also made. There was right to change the land, nationalizing development values. So one could also get the right to change land use. Further, we see there was input on how the development charges can be taken. Further, we see that to make existing use value as the basis for compensation. Okay. Further, we see there was improvement in compensation for the compulsory acquisition, which was earlier done based on the 1939 value, but then it would be revised according to 1944 Act. Furthermore, we see that regional planning started here since the constitution of Joint Planning Board for preparing regional scheme covering the jurisdiction of more than one local authority. So we also see that regional planning started here. Now we are seeing the country as well as the urban areas were seen in perspective. So regional planning also started here. So in this you can see the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947. In this you can see the provision for development plan. It is providing how to control the land use. Then you can also see the enforcement of planning control, orders for preservation of trees and woodlands. You can see here how those development controls are being specified. Further, it provided details on land acquisition, how the land can be acquired. Furthermore, we see it provided details on compensation on compulsory land acquisition. Likewise, we see it provided details on the development charges, how the development charges have to be taken here. After this, we see Town and Country Planning Law of 1968, which further improved upon the limitation of this act. As per the Victor Moore's writing in Planning in Britain, The Challenging Scene, published in 1972, he writes that in 1947, the Town and Country Planning Act introduced a comprehensive system of planning and planning control based on development plans prepared by local planning authorities and approved by the central government. These plans had to indicate the manner in which local planning authorities proposed that land in its area should be used and stages by which and development was to be carried out. So, it was very control oriented, and 21 years later this system was found to be in need of substantial change. So, we saw that there was need for flexibility. So, this particular act took care of that. Development plan prepared under the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 were subjected to increased criticism. So, there was a lot of criticism to that, and the original plans soon became outdated. So, whatever plans were being drafted, they were becoming outdated and they were rigid. So, the understanding of flexibility was coming. The Town and Country Planning Act of 1968 brought in these corrections and made the fundamental changes in form and content of the development plans. So, we see here that structural plan came into existence. So, if you will recollect, we talked about the flexibility and structural plan and the perspective plan coming in. So, here the realization came that how we have to really move towards the structural plan, which will be approved by the central government, and then the detailed plan would be done by the local authorities. It is intended that the structural plan will deal purely with policies applicable to major land uses such as housing, education, recreation and transportation, and the plan will not allocate particular parcel of land to particular purpose. This will be done by the local plans, which will deal with detailed planning of any area, as we had seen in different types and levels of plans. So, we see that the structural plan came here, and furthermore, we see that it also highlighted the need for conservation of areas, especially which were of heritage importance. Further, we see even public participation was highlighted here in this observation for this act. Moreover, we see that under this particular act, we see even Greater London Council came into picture, and that allowed review and interference and inquiry into the planning process. So, when we reached at this point, there was need for reviewing the town planning practice. It was felt that there was urgent need for review of these practices, and there was need for flexibility rather than being very rigid. And further, the important understanding which came here was that physical planning was also becoming integral part of the socio-economic planning, as well as we saw the need for public involvement was the realization for public involvement was also coming in here. So, based on that, there were a lot of reviews like People in Planning, Local Government in England. There were government proposal for reorganization in 1971. We further see that there were planning advisory group which made their observation, and it made the observation that 20 years of planning is very rigid and it is very cumbersome and it has too many details. So, because of that, a lot of revisions were required, and later the Town and Country Planning Act 1971 took care of all these flexibility and the concept of reviewing people's participation, as well as the structural plan concept came in finally here. So, this was what we looked at today. We looked at the sequential, the key dates and key interventions which took place in UK, and we saw that how it was beginning from how we started looking at what kind of public facilities has to be given, and then how land has to be acquired for that, and how the planning has to be done, and then how land has to be acquired and what kind of compensation has to be given, and further how we need to be flexible, further how the structural plan has to be done, and then we came to the understanding of how people have to be involved in the process. So we looked through all these acts today. We looked at the public health reform, we looked at the Edwin Chadwick's report, then John Snow's cholera map, then Great Stink of London, various committees we looked into today. And then we also talked about how working men's voting also changed the landscape of legislation, as well as we saw related to that a lot of acts came in, such as Housing of Working Class, and then we also see Hampstead and Town Planning Act, Addison Housing Act, and Housing and Town Planning Act. We also saw that how regional perspective came in, Town and Country Planning Act, then various committees which reviewed, then we also had New Town Act, as well as we look at the Town and Country Planning Act series of act coming in, and our understanding improving with that. So this was our coverage today. We are going to look at Indian landscape in the next class. Our coverage was limited with the scope to make you aware of the topic. There are enormous readings and movies available to explore. Few are suggested here. This is not an extensive list. You may feel free to suggest more from your experience. Please feel free to ask questions. Let us know about your concerns you have. Do share your opinion, experiences, and suggestions. Looking forward to interacting and co-learning with you while exploring cities and urban planning. Thank you so much.